Welcome to Smart Talk, where we speak with leading academics and other thoughtful persons on the important challenges facing the world today. My name is Edward Dodson. I am a longtime member of the faculty of the Henry George School of Social Science. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Mark Mollineaux, who hosts a radio discussion program on station KZSU on the campus of Stanford University, where Mark has a background in civil engineering. He is active in the California chapter of Common Ground USA, and his program frequently focuses on the political economy of Henry George and both the merits and complexities associated with George's proposal for land nationalization and the more gradualist policy of moving toward a property tax based on the taxation of land values alone. So for good reason, we're eager to hear from Mark on his valuable outreach efforts. Mark, welcome to Smart Talk.
Thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, the first thing I have to ask you is to give us a little bit of background in how you got interested in the political economy of Henry George and began your work to popularize the views that you learned from reading him or learning about him.
I think for years, I was more or less kind of a pragmatist as far as what's working, what isn't working in the economy, and so on, what is driving inequality, and so forth. But as far as housing, I think I didn't really have good answers for things. How are things priced? Why are things the way they are? When the 2008, boom and bust happened, it was clearly goofy. It seems like houses are being speculated upon. Now they're being, depreciating in value rapidly. This is clearly broken. And I went into structural engineering in part because I think of all the things I want to see in the world, I want to see a world where the cost of living is just cheaper. I'd like to see cheap goods, people who don't have to work like a dog to just get by. I think it's nice if people have breathing room. And the question is, could we make housing cheaper? And I think through years in structural engineering, I learned a lot. When people do cutting edge stuff, it's usually to make innovative, flashy structures. There isn't a whole lot of space that you can really do to make construction a lot cheaper. There's a lot of political aspects as far as permitting and other things. The hard costs aren't as meaningful as you'd expect. And then it really comes down to, how is land priced? And that's certainly a big factor. And I think, when I got into, what is the theory of land pricing, I think you eventually come to Henry George. And when I read the Wikipedia page, so it's like, wow, that's extremely compelling. This is, better part of a decade ago. It's like, that's extremely compelling. That's just way too simple. There must be a catch. So I spent like a couple of years just trying to tell me what the flaw is in this explanation of the law on rent governing land prices. This seems too pat to be true. Why aren't more people talking about this? And I think I just got convinced that this is correct. And once you know it, there's a lot of implications for drastically different tax policies. And then the question is, why isn't that happening? And I think then you're in the world of politics, and that's where I've been spending, the remainder of the time of finding out exactly why these aren't in place, and for not very surprising reasons.
Well, your experiences and mine are somewhat similar. As a younger person, I had the same questions that you've had, and I was in the real estate finance business. So I was making loans to people who were trying to buy housing and qualify for mortgage loans. And my generation had an easier time of it, even though at the time I was looking for housing, mortgage interest rates were pretty high. And now your generation seems to even have a greater challenge now that prices went sky high with interest rates at rock bottom lows. And now they're back up. And so there's a constituency out there for your message, I think, particularly in California where you are, right?
Well, absolutely. I think the tools haven't changed quickly enough. It's people who are still saying housing's way too expensive. We need to go to first-time home buyer assistance. which is, just basically inflating the credit bubble. You're not really changing the fundamentals. And when you are talking about limitations of actually getting physical goods to places, it makes a good deal of sense. Because if you talk about like how people visualize a mortgage, it's like, oh, you need a bunch of lumber. You can get some lumber here. People need to live inside this, lumber structure. You need the lumber now. And it's like, honestly, when it comes down to lumber, it makes a lot of sense. If you're talking about suburban sprawl, mortgage assistance makes a good deal of sense if it's really about getting that lumber. When you're talking about pre-existing infill or just kind of a pre-existing structure, you don't actually need to borrow to invest in stuff. And if you invest more, you're just going to bid up basically a positional good. So, but it's really crazy. California, we've had a lot of massive investments in affordable housing and housing assistance, and it's still going in the middle decades of the 21st century into home buyers assistance. And like I just think it's a bit archaic, and I think a lot of people are realizing, that these old tools certainly aren't continuing to work if they ever did.
Yeah, well, they did work. I have to say that, during the 70s and 80s, these programs did help increase the percentage of households who could afford to purchase a home and get in the home. The problem, of course, as you well know, is that they immediately became land speculators, because once you become a property owner, you're looking for the increase in equity in that property for retirement eventually, or if you are a young adult, perhaps single or married, and you begin to have a family, you might want to move up. You want to move out of that starter home into a larger home, and you're dependent upon the equity in that property and the increase in land value to help make the down payment on the next larger home. And it's an ever increasing, process of pricing ourselves out of the market in a sense. So these programs do have an effect, and my own view is that we still need them. We still need them now because we do not have land nationalization, or we do not have land value taxation that is sufficiently effective to bring down property prices. So the work is really difficult, and Common Ground USA has been one of the bright lights to help bring this whole question to the public. And certainly your program, and hopefully what we're doing at the Henry George School, adds light on the problem as well.
I mean, like most things, it's a mixture of good and bad. I think reform is certainly on the table. If you were to make it such that mortgages, basically, let's say federally underwritten mortgages are limited to actually credit on the structure, I think that's actually a very interesting idea. Or basically, if you try to push more of it towards new builds, even if there is still a land component, that isn't ideal. But, when you kind of inflate credit for pre-existing structures, it's not really clear if that's really an effective policy. But I think credit is still going to be part of I think housing going ahead in different ways.
Well, it has to, because household incomes and savings just aren't keeping pace with the increase in property prices. And what economists such as the University of California economist Mason Gaffney, did you ever meet Mason by or have any interaction with him?
Not in person. Actually, I knew people who were talking to him towards, because I was again in the scene. Mason, I think his hearing was already kind of gone. He was still extremely bright, through his 90s. But I think it was a bit difficult to have a conversation with him as much as I would have liked to.
Well, in one of his papers that he wrote, he made that argument that you put forward, that that one way we could introduce some reforms in the financial system was to prohibit any financial institution that accepts government insured deposits from extending credit to purchase land or accepting land value as collateral for borrowing. Now, that would not necessarily reduce property prices, But it would mean that we as taxpayers would have less exposure to bank bailouts when property markets fail, that the commercial banks at least would have a lower exposure to debt. Some other type of investor would come into the picture, whether it's BlackRock or some of the corporate investors would provide the down payment money, for mortgage financing, but of course at a higher rate of interest because they would take on the added risk. So we really have a great need for the work that you're doing with Common Ground USA and the efforts to get land value tax passed, to get it to a point where it is sufficiently high, in my view, to have an effect on the market demand. And so begin to bring down land prices. Otherwise, we're still going to need significant public subsidy for housing, because there are a lot of young people who are becoming adults, and some of them, at least, we're going to want to move out of their parents' house and strike out on their own.
And I definitely want to, second that recommendation. Gaffney's paper about money, banking, and basically his spin on the real bills doctrine. It's a fascinating idea that I think, as far as our boom bust cycle, the fact that kind of the froth that we built into the system of kind of bidding up and collateralizing positional goods, it's not great. But certainly, I think you talk about the fact that housing is not working for younger people. I think, depending on where you are. I mean, my sister or something could get a place in Ohio without too much worries in her 20s and 30s. But here in California, you have people who are fairly well-paid professionals who kind of are resigned to being a renter, and I'd say there are two ways to deal with that. One is you can try to change that and make people not renters, or you could change the way the tenancy works so it's not basically a second-class citizen program. Many places in Europe, for example, where tenancy has stronger protections, people will rent their entire lives, and that's fine. They're not a loser. It's they have stability, autonomy. Here, that's not the way that it's built up. If you're not a homeowner, you're a nobody, and that's it's not sustainable if now you have an entire generation of people who believe they're all losers. Like, I think something has to give. And I think trying to look at programs, I think one way to square the circle is certainly limited equity programs that, similar to how Singapore does their public housing. If you have, public land, people sell condos off, they have stability, autonomy, they own that condo. But it's not you can actually control it better. That's certainly an approach that I think a lot of people are exploring.
There are quite a few limited equity cooperatives on the East Coast. Is that an increasing way that properties are being converted from apartment buildings, et cetera, on the West Coast? Are you seeing any of that in terms of changing the market mix?
I think it definitely has a lot of buzz. Does it really scale up to create the number of units? I think we are continuing to hold on to our unlimited equity institutions. I mean, it's not sexy, but and there's certainly a lot of exploitation, but mobile home parks are an example of that. And I think trying to keep people housed in those mobile home parks is an ongoing task, because those are usually people clinging on to the edge of the margins of our cities. Land trusts, community land trusts are a extremely exciting deal. I think the real question is, can you do more to put land in a public portfolio or semi-public community portfolio, whatever you call it, into a community land trust that can actually house a lot of people? I think the problem is when the land trusts we have don't tend to be well capitalized, don't tend to have a great reinvestment structure, and they just don't grow more units as time goes on. Back in Cincinnati, they've had a West End Community Land Trust since the early 80s, and it just hasn't grown. And I think it's desperately needed that places like that are actually offering kind of an alternative. I think if nothing else, and there's a lot of questions you can have about the mixture of reinvestment of basically market rents into new growth versus should you get subsidy for sub-market rents for your residents. If you go all on subsidy end, you don't have any room for reinvestment. I certainly don't want to say that there isn't room for subsidy in this mix, but you have to find the right balance. And I worry that no one is doing it to the other end except for basically private landlords, and that's not ideal for a number of reasons.
Let me ask you about the audience you're reaching with your radio program. I mean, I've listened to a number of your programs. I really found the interview you did with Patrick Condon really interesting, and Lars Doucette and a few others. Have you had an opportunity, for example, to attract a discussion with major employers in the area? I mean, they obviously have a stake in affordable housing for their employees, so that commuting times are reduced, and the cost. Obviously, when housing is so costly, employees are going to ask for higher incomes, and that puts stress on profit margins, et cetera, et cetera. So, have you had any opportunity to talk to any of the major employers and talk to them about these housing issues and the land problem?
I have, on the show, I have yet to have a representative per se, but I certainly know how they exist in the ecosystem. And as far as, the YIMBY scene, people, Yes, My Backyard, essentially the broad coalition of people who are pro-housing, a lot of these people are self-interested employees. A lot of them are tech employees. Because the show is in Stanford University, right in the heart of Silicon Valley, USA. Right. And a lot of people, it's either they are, renters. They, it's they are in a situation they know things aren't great. They're paying too much. They don't like it. And I think a lot of them also, it kind of just becomes an interesting political scene. It's fun to scrap. So I think it's people get into local politics for the fun of it. So I think talking to the the employees, they a lot of them are certainly into the scene. The employers, they don't like to see their money be wasted. They don't like to see overpaying for land. I mean, a lot of these places, especially before COVID, when office space was at a premium, were desperate to basically buy up, lease a lot of land. It's very interesting. As far as getting value back to the community, a place like Mountain View would be introducing things like head taxes on major employers. This would scale up with number of employees. And honestly, the amount of money it brought in was not that much. It was less than the amount of money they brought in through leasing office structures to places like Apple and Google, which is, I think it kind of shows you, having land ownership in public hands and being able to lease it out gets you a lot of money. So it certainly is in the employer's interest to keep land prices low, because that's going to allow them to actually administer the office space. As far as how do they express themselves politically, I don't know how it works in other places per se, if it's the same kind of way. I believe it more or less is. There's usually a regional kind of governance structure of big employers who work to basically state their employer interests. Bay Area Council is what we have here in the Bay Area. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, you get your Apples, your Googles, places like Oracle, blah, blah, blah. And it is, not a secret that they work very closely with YIMBY interests. People would say, oh, it's just mean it's big biz. It's like, no, I mean, they've shared interests. That's politics. So I think the difference is I'm more interested in, I think just like, it's not that exciting to see a major business interest throw the weight around. It's predictable. They're pretty conservative. I think it's part of the political structure. It's just they don't have a whole lot to say. I guess I like to speak to people with maybe more ideological bent. Whereas if it's like, here's my interests, I like to express them. That's, if it's what you predict, there's not a whole lot you can really get out of them. But it's interesting. It's certainly important to understand where they are.
Well, our colleague Fred Harrison in the UK has made the case, in my view, for pretty convincingly, that the enemy of, or the opponent of the kind of change that we've been seeking is the middle class homeowner. And there's a strong argument that he's right, because let's face it, in the United States, the net worth of most households comes in whatever equity they have in their residential property. The statistics are not that encouraging about savings and pension funds and having investment portfolios. Something like 1 out of 4 senior citizens in the United States today lives on Social Security benefits alone, has no savings, has no pension. So there are a lot of people who are looking to that equity that they have in their residential property. And so the challenge is, how do you convince them it's in their long-term best interest to accept this system where the value of land may fall and their ability to build equity through land value increases might disappear. Has that come up in any of your discussions on the program?
I mean, on Twitter, in my bio, I say I am an opponent to homeownership. Like I go out that far because that is something that, I memean, people, it's very weird. Like a lot of times that people take, I'm pro, I'm anti, it's 50-50. If you say you're anti-home ownership, you'll get 99% of people angry at you. It's actually kind of funny because that's something that's like, we all believe in the power of home. Like you can talk to Marxists, you can talk to communists. So like, it's like, well, that's personal property. We still love home ownership. It's like, okay, it's very weird. If everybody's on the same page, something screwy's going on, because that's just not how it should work. But I definitely think a key is, I mean, in California, there's no two ways around it. We've gone this far in the conversation. Tax revolts, Proposition 13.
Yeah.
I think, insofar as a lot of your people may not be intimately aware of California politics, should I give you a quick explainer of Prop 13?
Go ahead. Many of the listeners to Smart Talk have some familiarity with Prop 13, but
yeah, I mean, it has
please.
cousins in other places. Up in the Pacific Northwest, they have the Measure 5 in Oregon. It's and they keep on trying to pass in places like Illinois and Texas. But yeah, 1978, it's largely upper middle class, affluent, predominantly white tax revolt. There was a book called Revolt of the Haves describing what went on. The leader was the demagogue Howard Jarvis, who had a career in kind of the John Birch Society. Just a repugnant fellow, just a vehement racist. But he captured the hearts of millions when it came down to, hey, wouldn't you rather pay less in property taxes? And even in California, that spoke to people, and it passed with a fairly large supermajority. And what it did, put on the books, ad valorem taxes are illegal. You cannot pass new taxes that relate to the value of an asset such as real estate. And the existing rates, insofar as they're locked in to the sale price assessment, and you can't, that can only go up 2% per year. So essentially sub CPI most of the time. And it can't be more than a 1% mill rate. So it still takes in a lot, because when it is sold, then the rate gets reassessed. So it tends to basically shift to new sellers, for new buyers. Long-time buyers don't have much. Has a lock-in effect. In other places, back in Ohio, people moving from one place to another in a neighborhood is very, very common. In California, people live in a place for decades because you'd be a sucker to move, because you'd be, reassessing your tax. People just can't really afford that, which has a lot of negative effect. You have people who are aging in place who would much rather downsize, and they can't. That's not good. They've tried to, have a bunch of bills to kind of adjust this. But in general, I think that the strong argument can be made. It has capitalized these tax savings, per se, into higher upfront real estate prices. This tends to create a larger barrier for people to get on the homeownership ladder in the first place. And I think that's really the big challenge to me about the politics of land value tax is even if you do it right. Look up at Vancouver. They did everything right under single tax Taylor back in the 19 teens, was it?
Yeah.
Uh, but, flash forward a few decades, a lot of normal people are real estate investors into their single family homes. Wouldn't you like to get a tax cut? They would. So unless you have some sort of governing structure, such as direct public ownership, perhaps strong, bylaws that can't be superseded, that basically, make sure you can't do a tax revolt, you're going to get a tax revolt if you have homeowners. I think it's an inevitability. I think the places that have actually achieved something closer to community land rent enjoyment have had public land ownership directly, such as Singapore, because you can't do a tax revolt there. I mean, do you think differently, or do you think am I too pessimistic?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And Americans have a long history of being land seekers. I mean, you just have to think about the origins of the colonial, migration to the New World, and what was one of the main reasons. Well, it was to find, land that they could afford, to have their own, piece of land that they could grow their food on and raise their families with, without having to be responsive to an absentee landlord somewhere in London. So this is, I think, been something we've inherited, and our public policy response to the rising population that we've had and the disappearance of free and inexpensive land has been extremely slow. And so in my own professional experience, we've had to rely on all sorts of gimmicks in order to try to some extent, mitigate the harm that the current market structure imposes on communities.
The frontier in America is very key. We were a colonized frontier in the world, and then over the 19th century, as a lot of political conflicts could and were resolved through the endless frontier of the West. And Manifest Destiny was a way to basically stop a lot of, strife from happening, a lot of people at each other's necks. And what happened? Eventually, the frontier ran out. We went to the West Coast, no more frontier. I think something that, a previous guest, yours, Christopher England, definitely talks about. It's, something I think a lot of people thought, independently. The failure of the Georgist movement around the turn of the century was the fact that even though it seemed like that frontier was closed, we need to actually deal with this. We found a new frontier, and the new frontier was the suburbs. New transportation technology allowed us to basically expand the frontier within every metro area into more and more places out to the edge, which is basically new free land, free real estate. And it worked. I mean, I think that it incurred a lot of technical debt. It was not great for a lot of reasons, but this did get the boot off people's necks for the better part of a century. But the problem is it ran out. The highways are clogged. Like out in California, people have commutes of like 6 hours a day. It's insane. No one should do this. And the answer cannot continue to be drive till you qualify, because you're going to. We're seeing an end of it. I mean, you could maybe say, is there going to be a new frontier? Is the new frontier telecommuting? Is it going to be living in independent small towns where you only interact with, job centers through the internet? Is it going to be self-driving cars in which you sleep in your car? I don't know. I hope not. I mean, I think that cities matter. Cities are going to exist, and we need to make cities work. And I think these Band-Aid solutions have definitely run out of juice.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And, I've been fortunate to live in the Philadelphia area. And one of the great benefits of living in this part of the country is that we have an excellent public transit system. And so I live in southern New Jersey, just across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. I drive 1 mile to the train station, and then it's a 20-minute ride on the train into Philadelphia.
Is that Patco?
Patco, yeah.
Cool.
And that's how I got to work every day for 30 years practically. And now that I'm retired, one of my retirement activities is I play softball a couple times a week. And so on Wednesday morning, I will sometimes get on the highway to drive to our softball location. And I just see all these people sitting there, bumper to bumper, stopped on the interstate, highway and some of the main roads. And I think, my goodness, how much time we're wasting, how much energy we're consuming, with no productivity as an outcome. And how can we put the genie back in the bottle? And the answer, of course, is the answer you and I know and share with some others, and that is we have to tax land and bring down the price of land by removing the rent of land as a private source of income.
Yeah, I think you can talk to Normie. I mean, interrupt you.
No, go on.
Yeah, but okay. So I think you talk to normies who would say, okay, I this whole land tax stuff, that's a bit galaxy brained. But I agree, trains are great, cars are not working. We just need to build more transit. And I think you talk about what actually works out there. It's it's no shock that in California Common Ground, we are limited because Prop 13. You can try to have a frontal assault, you can try to carve out parts of it. But the limitations on having a full land value tax are certainly closed off. But we have actually found a lot of interest in kind of targeted transit investment structures. There is there's an ambitious plan to expand transit in the 21 county region of the Bay Area. This is including Sacramento, Santa Cruz, Yuba City. Called Link 21, and this would, I think, take pressure off our congested highways by actually doing higher throughput transit. Would that also require mixed use development around these transit areas? I mean that's really what's necessary for transit oriented development to really work. And so, how do you get people to accept high densities and mixing residential and commercial and office buildings together in the same basic geography, so that people don't have to get in an automobile to travel from one place to another? Yeah, I mean it's tough. I mean, I think right now the state of the art is bad. You go on the Caltrain, which is one of the oldest commuter railroads out there, certainly on the West Coast. And a lot of the stations, it's super low density. I lived in Palo Alto, 4 blocks away from a Caltrain station, and single family zoned, just nothing anywhere. I was living in an ADU in the backyard. But people are trying to, I think in California, their TOD is something that is extremely popular among folks who know we need more housing. And there's been a lot of frontal assaults. SB 827 back in 2017, which was, unsuccessful, but retooled, brought back. These were all essentially removing local permitting barriers within different, radiuses around transit areas, depending on how good the transit is. And I don't think we'll reach the promised land yet. There's still a lot of density that is not there. We have a whole retooled housing element structure. I mean, you can get in the weeds and stuff, and I think it's unfortunate that places like Palo Alto still are preserving low density around the transit, but everyone knows that's a problem. I think local governance is an issue. I think California remains a bleeding edge. And how do you reform just how local land use works? And I think we're getting there. It's a long struggle because people, localism has all the cards in the long term. The states delegate their land use power to the cities. It's very hard to get it back, but they're working on it. Is eminent domain a potentially useful tool for changing land use from, single family detached housing on a
quarter acre lot to something more high density? Is that
At the local level, it's poison. In a place like Palo Alto, I think for good reason. I said Prop 13 locks you into place. So even if you're bought out at the fair market rate price, it kind of means you're displaced forever. So if you have a community, I think it's best understood to understand a small city like Palo Alto as like a big HOA. It is run by homeowners for homeowners. So if they're going to vote on, hey, do we want to have eminent domain to expand, basically our transit capacity, or certainly to build higher density stuff, that people are going to shout that down. Can eminent domain come in at higher levels? Certainly it is extremely rare. I don't know if it statutorily they are prohibited, but it would be nice if the state government would just do more eminent domain. That doesn't happen for anything less than Caltrans projects, the state DOT. And as far as that goes, you'll see that happen in low income areas for highways. That still happens to this day. It's kind of insane that we still displace people to build highways and essentially nothing else. Certainly not to build housing that's dense. But the power is there. It's not expressed. I think there's limited political will. Eminent domain is certainly seen as unpopular by many.
Am I correct that California is still experiencing a net outflow of residents and businesses? I mean, my understanding is that the first phase was many businesses, and then people followed to Nevada, and then Texas became the next attractive location because of all of the lower property values and lower taxes. So, is that something that you're noticing, or that the political leaders are concerned about?
Yeah, there's domestic. I mean, there's domestic outflows to the Central Valley. The Central Valley being cheaper areas, Stockton, Fresno, and that it's people who can't afford to be in the Bay Area have gone further and further. But certainly, there's been state to state displacement. I think I don't quote me on it, but I believe we're still in the net negative as far as outflows go. Are people concerned? I think. I think as far as the California compact, which is we give landowners a good deal, but we have some of the highest sales taxes anywhere. We have relatively high state income taxes by state standards, and that's worked out fairly stably, largely because these continue to be extremely productive job centers. The Bay Area, Silicon Valley, everyone, in Southern California, the job centers remain strong. But there's always moaning of like, okay, we're all here because we're here. It's a self-perpetuating cycle. The job center is the job center because it has a history of being the job center. But if you were doing it today, they wouldn't be in the high cost area. They'd be in a low cost area, but it's very hard to get from here to there. COVID, I think a lot of people were predicting it would have disrupted it. I don't think that happened. I think that Silicon Valley is staying put, at least for the moment. So I think there's certainly some stickiness there. So
are people returning to the office more and more, or is there still a good deal of working remotely, even from the tech people in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I think there's kind of a new compact, which is 3-day in-person work weeks. 4-day weekends is pretty is pretty common. Work from home Friday, Monday. I think depending on where you are, the office vacancy rate can be higher. In downtown San Francisco, up there, it's quite a bit more of a ghost town. I don't know exactly what the story is about, what is going on with those offices, but I think that there's a bit more continuity with the Silicon Valley. But you do see a lot of plans being scaled back. It was just announced this last week here that Google was planning to expand into downtown San Jose. This is going to be around the major transit station, the Diridon station, which is kind of the super hub. This is where the Caltrain meets and the regional rail meets, and they're going BART there. So it's going to be the Penn Station of the Bay Area. And they're going to build a lot of offices right near there. San Jose gave away, at a song, certainly they sold off land at a discount to encourage this. And Google said, hey, you know what? Because we're doing kind of fine with our offices now, we're not super heated. We're actually putting this on hold. So it's like, okay, this is, if you try to encourage stuff through these kind of giveaways, make sure that you're not just getting going to give stuff away for and get nothing in return, because it seems like they're the old kind of trade-off of you're at least going to get development here. They're not getting that, certainly not for the foreseeable future. So what a mess.
Yeah, cities make the gamble that by giving a company a huge subsidy to locate, that the revenue generated by the employees coming into the city every day will create enough revenue to offset what was lost by the subsidies. But from the economic analysis that I've read, it rarely works out.
And it seems like, okay, like if you do that and you're recouping it through income taxes, sales taxes, why not also recoup it through land value uplift in the long term? In the 1960s, when they were building BART in the first place, you had the economist Barbara Ward, come in and say, you really should be doing value capture here. It will pay for itself through the value. And they didn't. They had a bunch of bills that were kind of seen as too ambitious. They had these value capture districts that are left, undone. They deal with sales tax because it was politically convenient. It's not going to upset anybody. And in the long term, they've left untold billions on the table of land value uplift. And I think there is a lack of long-termism. I think you can say that the sales tax revenue that kicks in year one, income tax year one, the land value uplift, that's a longer term investment. And I think it's not surprising that politicians will ignore a long-term investment in order for immediate action. And I think that's unfortunate because I think it's
no doubt about it. I attended many ribbon cutting ceremonies with political, people who wanted the media there to take their photograph when we were creating 10 units of affordable housing in a neighborhood somewhere that, that needed infill development. I lost the train of thought a while ago, and I wanted to mention something to you when you're talking about community land trusts, that I think the future for community land trust can be dramatically improved if cities create programs on a scattered site basis. The difficulty is trying to aggregate land contiguously. But if you create a program where the land can be put in the trust wherever it exists in the city, and the opportunity then becomes one of bringing that land in the trust, at least for the time that the eligible buyers remain in that property, then once they decide that they need to move on for whatever reason, that property can go on the market, and there could be some formula for splitting up the proceeds of sale, and the land can come back on the basic market, and the proceeds of whatever profits are earned can go into the land trust to help another potential buyer buy a property somewhere else in the city. And I developed that scheme when I was at Fannie Mae, but we never could really get it off the ground. It's been something that I've whenever I've had an opportunity to talk to people who are in the land trust bandwagon, that they should consider trying to push for that approach. But anyway,
that's interesting. I mean, it's that's very at heads with the kind of prevailing ideology of what the point of a land trust is. Because I think the people who are most for it would say it's about acquisition of units to shield them from the market, as it were, the market. So you do see scattered site inventories of land trusts in play. I believe like the San Francisco and the Oakland Land Trust have similar basis of like, you look at, our properties, and it is a bunch of apartment buildings throughout, the area. I think that a major problem, like, I mean, you could say it's a problem. I would say certainly a major problem is that it's stasis. In the long term, they hold on to inventory. It doesn't grow very much. They don't change the inventory very much. They don't make it bigger or whatever. And that's a problem. I mean, your idea is not so much develop the land as much as, kind of ride land value uplift and actually sell it off and actually get more money through
back to the trust.
Yeah,
To
exactly.
help the next eligible couple or a household that needs to find affordable housing. And
yeah, I think if it's an apartment, it's difficult because if you're selling it off, you'd either need it to be synchronized so everyone is out, or you're selling it while they're still in there, and is that going to be displacement?
I mean, an entire apartment building.
Yeah, exactly. That's a lot of CLTs will have an ownership like that, and it's kind of a related kind of program. People are for something called COPA or TOPA. This is in several cities looking to be expanded. Community or Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act.
Right.
If it's tenant opportunity, it kind of would become a co-op. If it's a COPA, it would be rolled into a nonprofit or a public agency. Would be my preference. And that could be a land trust, and this would be a lot of times it is kind of a problem. What if you have kind of a small apartment building run by kind of your stereotypical mom and pop, but they want to get out of the business. The easiest thing for them to do is sell it off someone else to investor, and oftentimes the investor will say, or before this happens, the easiest thing to do based upon a California guaranteed right to maximum land return is the Ellis Act, which allows them to sell, like basically evict everyone, just like that.
Yeah.
Because for better or for worse, especially if you have rent control, your tenants are ruining your land speculation. These darn people are limiting how far my money should be able to go. Thank God we protect those landowners by allowing you to evict renters to make sure that they don't get screwed out of their fair market value. It's grotesque, but that's on the book. So I think COPA is kind of seen as a way around that, which is you roll it into your local land trusts. I think a major problem. This is underfinanced to do it at any sort of scale. This is another case. If you had a land value tax on the books, the acquisition cost would be a lot closer to $0, which means that if kind of you just went out of the business, get out of the business, and now the land trust takes it over, but we just can't afford to buy it at this point because it's that land basis.
Yeah, what people don't really accept, and this is a great conversation we're having because some of our listeners, I think, will benefit from some of the specifics that we've gone over that they don't generally get to hear, is that a housing unit, any building, is a depreciating asset. And so, what's the value of a building? It's replacement cost less how much it's been depreciated. But that's not how much the property sells for because of the land. And so, so people have a great deal of sentiment invested in their building, their property, but an unrealistic expectation of what it's really worth in the market, as a building.
Yeah, people, they lie to themselves. People say, "Oh, it's because I did a great job, tending my garden, and that one time I fixed the roof." It's like, that's holding back time. That is not the reason your $100,000, tiny little box became a $3 million property in Sunnyvale, California.
Yeah, let's focus the rest of our time together on a discussion about the attraction of younger people to the work that you're doing with Common Ground USA. I think many of us are encouraged by the number of young people who come into the movement through Common Ground. And I just like to have you share some of what you're seeing in terms of people your own age or younger, and how they're finding the message that Common Ground has delivered to be attractive. And Do they really understand the economics involved, or is it mostly just a general sympathy with the idea that, geez, the cost of living is so high, we need to do something about it?
I think for any political program to be successful, it needs to be a big tent. It needs to be a big umbrella. And you need to get in, basically eggheads and normies. Not everybody is going to geek out about ideology. Very few people are. Very few people really care about municipal finance in an abstract way. Only weirdos do. I think thank God for people who do. I think, we need the weirdos, but you need to, make it attractive to people who kind of don't think about boring, weird stuff. And I think, honestly, the YIMBY movement is something which has more appeal for people who aren't, weirdos. It's if you say, hey, I want to see more cute walkable areas. I want to see more trolley cars. It's like you can get a lot of, buy-in with stuff like that.
Right.
And I think what's nice is that you're seeing kind of an interface between the kind of normie, crowd. It could be everyone from like young people who just like, oh yeah, it's like we need more places to live here. It's too expensive, and I'd like to see more trains. To kind of older people, kind of like the stereotypical wine moms who kind of just want to have this house we believe, and I think more and more people are going to it'd be better if you see less exclusionary policies in your neighborhood. And but then when you get down to a lot of kind of problems, as it were, it's like, oh, who's going to pay for the extra costs of schools? It's nice. Who's going to pay for all this transit infrastructure? Then you get the eggheads on board who kind of explain, oh, if you have a tax basis that expands, all these problems that seem hard suddenly become a lot more tractable. And I think what's nice, too, is that you get a lot of, I would just kind of say pessimistic doomsayers who are kind of anti-change for various reasons. Some of them are just kind of stick in the mud conservatives. Some of them have kind of more egghead answers themselves, which is like, oh, you expect, private for-profit land speculators and developers to make housing cheaper in the long term. How are they going to build into a glut? I think you can find more and more sophisticated takes. And what's interesting is I think when kind of the Georgist paradigm, as it were, offers a very comprehensive kind of foundation for dealing with all these problems. It anticipates a lot of these doomsayers. It kind of understands where they're coming from. So I think I think a good political movement is able to give people solutions for what they want to see. Most people don't want to see land value taxes as an end to itself. Most people want to see a more vibrant, verdant, beautiful world with cheaper housing. And I think that's what's nice. It's a nice combination of kind of normal people and problem solvers. And I think that's the real goal here.
Do you think that there's sufficient thoughtfulness within the two major parties to find a way to bring these ideas to the mainstream within both parties, or are we really destined to deal with a very minor part of the Democratic and Republican Party supporting the kinds of changes that are necessary, and is the political side somewhere a battle between the Greens and the Libertarians?
Well, I can't speak too broadly because I live in a one-party state. We have Democratic supermajorities. Nominally, our local elections are nonpartisan. No one has a D or an R next to their name. In practice, people tend to identify as Dems even locally. But I think it really means that you kind of see a lot of rifts between a party. I think you tend to see more or less people who would be Republicans elsewhere would be kind of a conservative colored Dem in California. It more or less means that I think the culture war isn't here. You don't, I think it's kind of crazy. I mean, we saw homophobic constitutional amendments, 15 years ago, but now that has gone way, way into the background. So I think as far as a culture war, that's settled, but there's a lot of kind of sublimated economic fights all within the Democratic Party. I think state to state. I mean, we see things like in Arizona a few weeks ago. There was arguments against development because it helps land speculators and so on by the Democratic Party of Arizona, which is kind of the woke way to just basically be status quoist. People like Patrick Condon up in Vancouver, will take George's arguments where it's appropriate in order to kind of fight against development and not do much more. But I think the overall alignment is clear. I think what you see in Long Island is you're going to see a lot more of that articulated. People want to build more apartments in exclusive suburbs, and who is upset? The GOP of New York. That's not surprising. I think the argument that you can get a lot of kind of moderate, fiscal people who lean conservative to see the light, I think makes a lot of sense in places that aren't so culture war tinged or are, kind of adjacent to it. I think it more or less works. One extremely interesting rift I'd want to see more of is, the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce, in almost any city is going to be extremely change averse. They're going to be conservative. They're going to certainly oppose, a property tax change. I think to just as a sideline, in the last couple of weeks, we have seen, or last couple of months, we've seen a land value tax study bill introduced in California by Assembly Member Alex Lee. This got an incredible amount of pushback, by kind of larger, you could say broader business interests, but certainly the Landlords Association, realtors, and a lot of, I think, interestingly tapped in interests that are invested in sprawl. The highway builders, people who do flashers for highway construction, gas station folks, like, wow, okay, that's very interesting that you kind of all know what's up. But very specifically, if you talk about chambers of commerce, do they have the same interest? Because you have commercial landlords, you have commercial tenants.
Yeah.
Those, that is not the same people. That you actually have very different economic aims. And when you see things like California trying to pass a narrow constitutional amendment to repeal Prop 13 for commercial units, this almost passed back in 2020. You got pushback by a lot of people saying that this is going to harm commercial tenants. Would it? The unfortunate answer is, based on triple net leases, it would. There is, almost a large majority of commercial leases say that any property tax increase will be borne 100% by the tenant. To me, that's anti-business. I think seeing reform here, because I think people aren't really as sympathetic to commercial tenants versus commercial landlords. People don't think about that much, but that's one political battle out there. So I think the larger ideological lens of GOP versus Dem is hard to say, because I think the only thing that really can divide them is culture war about stuff like, social issues. I think for the issues as far as municipal finance, you're going to be a lot more specific. And honestly, I think if you talk about the Green and the Libertarians, I don't think that, one, they are ever going to matter politically, and two, I think ideologically, they just don't really have room in their vocabulary to talk about municipal finance, for better or for worse.
Well, they can talk about it, but hardly anyone's listening. Or
yeah, I mean,
the people who are listening are the same people who have been listening for the last, couple of generations.
Yeah. I mean, the Libertarian Party has been taken over by strong, basically Rothbard fascist. They've never been a very serious org, but I certainly don't see much coming out of those two parties. In California, in the long term, you'd say that, the general way that politics works, you'd expect a schism at some point. If we're a one-party state, you're going to see two parties. That hasn't happened yet. I think you see a lot of kind of caucuses. You see a lot of kind of de facto blocks within the Democratic Party. Certainly, you're seeing that on housing issues. How is this going to develop, and is there going to be a room for? I mean, could you imagine that a schism would be kind of a pro housing ideological node with Georgia's characteristics? I can imagine it.
Well, in so many ways, California has led the way for the rest of the nation. Perhaps not lately when you refer to the cultural wars, but maybe Californians will finally come to their common sense in terms of the way the state begins to raise revenue. And so there's hope for the future that maybe a response to Prop 13 might develop. A lot of these old property owners, maybe they eventually want to retire somewhere else and will begin selling off the property. I mean, I'm in the baby boom generation. I suspect many of those who benefited from Prop 13 are in my age group, and those properties are going to start transferring one way or another, and maybe in large numbers.
Yeah, is it going to be a peaceable transfer? Because I think at one point through retirement or, the inevitable embrace of death, as eventually older homeowners are going to shift their ownership elsewhere. Is that going to happen while maintaining prices, or is there going to be a 2008, correction?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think that's an open question. I would bet by the fact there's so much pent up demand that it's going to stay nice and taut. But we'll see. I mean, when I first moved to California for grad school, I read the quote pretty early that California is the rest of the country 15 years in the future, and I think it's true. I think the problems we see with our urban areas, I think they're coming elsewhere. I think urbanization is a process which will continue. And, today you might see more affordable living in the Midwest. I think that's, I think the clock's ticking.
Well, we haven't even discussed during our conversation today the environmental challenges. I mean, certainly California it seems like every week on the news, there's some new sort of natural or human-made disaster, and it's spreading all over the country. I mean, it's the rising sea level, droughts, earthquakes, tornadoes.
Yeah, do you have thoughts in general about? I mean, that's a major political fight. Should the state continue to underwrite the risk of living in wildfire areas, because wildfires are happening? We have a yearly wildfire season now in California. It's absurd. And I think even in the Bay Area, you're not talking about out in Paradise, California, where there are the fires. But in a place like the Berkeley Hills, it's populated by eucalyptus trees. They imported that to California. They have the minor shortcoming; they explode. It is one of the riskiest fire areas anywhere. Should we try to get people out of those forests, or
Well, I think the key issue there is that when your property is destroyed, should the government provide low interest loans or some sort of grants to help you rebuild? And certainly the private insurance sector is going to raise insurance rates whenever their losses cause them to need to get additional premiums coming in. So in certain parts of the country already, people either cannot afford the insurance that would be required to protect them. And the question is, if they don't have the private insurance protection, will the government come in to provide assistance? And whether that is politically expedient, but certainly, we look at our public debt, and we have to ask the question, unless we change our tax system and begin bringing in more tax revenue, will the federal government or state governments have the revenue to bail people out that way? These are big questions, Mark. Maybe the next guest you have on your program could be an economist who has some insight into how to make all this work for us.
perhaps if you're dropping a hint, yeah. But is we about out of time here?
Yeah, I think we will wrap it up. And I maybe if you want to tell the listeners who you plan on having on your program next, that would be great.
So I think we had an episode on single stair reform. That's something we can talk about. You get land, kind of assembling land. We have I think surveying what's happening around the country. A long time desire to kind of know more about the wackiness of New York City property tax structures. Have some more local stuff about Marin County. Discussion I had with David Colander about kind of macro, kind of inflationary issues in the 1970s and so on. But it's a grab bag. I mean, it's I think you probably know it's when you do a show, you have to see what interests you. So and hope that the audience follows.
Well, I think our audience will greatly enjoy listening to this conversation and what you've had to share with us. And I thank you for taking the time to join us on this edition of Smart Talk. So, listeners, that's it for this edition. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. Again, I'm Edward Dodson, and thank you for watching Smart Talk.